think the technical fix is battery vehicles and biofuel, and I suspect that's not really sustainable because of the opportunity cost of that electricity or that biofuel. I mean, if you're using it for cars, then it's not available for other things, and we will need all those sources for things that are less easily substitutable. I think the answer has to be public transport, a much greater level of public transport. And I mean, if we look at the bus system in Brighton, for example, I remember when my wife came here in '97 and the fare was 60p, and it's now, what, £2.20. Has inflation really gone that fast? I mean, it does seem that the policy on public transport is to make driving cars so horrendous that people are forced to go to public transport, rather than making public transport so attractive that they don't actually want to go in their cars because it's much easier not to go that way. But you know, public transport has to be the way forward because it's so much more efficient than individual vehicles. Of course, there'll always be a place for individual vehicles, but public transport has to be the rule, and individual journeys, I think, is the exception.
I think that's a very good answer, but I would just like to make the point that public transport is no longer publicly owned, and that actually every time you step onto a bus or a train, you are providing part of the profitability of large corporations that own our public transport.
Well, very briefly, I entirely agree with Stephen. I think public transport needs to be a substantial answer to this question. And there will be, in terms of cars, I think a shift to hybrid vehicles and ultimately to electric cars. But I think the real problem is going to be air transport, because if we did use biofuels, the scale of what is required would enormously dent food production across the world. And one of the problems is, of course, in America, which is one of the granaries, in North America, one of the granaries of the world, under George Bush, in order to reduce US dependence on Middle East oil, there was a very substantial tax breaks given to farmers to shift to biofuels. And they did so, and what happened? There were food demonstrations, there were strikes right across many parts of Africa and some parts of Asia because of the lack of food. So I don't think that is an option. And it is a very difficult question, this whole question of air transport. It is, of course, the well-off and the rich who use overwhelmingly planes. People who are semi-skilled or unskilled workers hardly use planes at all. It is very much the rich and the middle class who are driving this, and getting them to do it less, I think, requires a lot of thought, because at the moment I'm not convinced how we do it.
Thanks very much, Michael. Brenda, yes, I'll come on to other points. Brenda,
yeah, just wanted to flag up that I mentioned about the Queen's speech the 4th or the 5th of June earlier in my talk on fracking. You may or may not know that there's a growth and infrastructure bill, which is where that trespass law that I talked about is going to be mentioned. Within that, the government has very much got back on the cards a road building programme that we heard about in the 90s and fought quite hard against down here, partly because it would just encourage road traffic growth. And if you are interested, there's a group emerging again to link up some of the different people in different towns along the south coast and in other parts of the UK, and campaign for better transport, which used to be called Transport 2000. If you look on their website, they've got a campaign called Roads to Nowhere, and they are setting up and trying to re-establish campaign groups, because a lot of what the government is saying is different to what they're doing, as we heard with the Greenest Government Ever statement, and these sorts of things are coming back on the table, so it's worth watching out for. Well, just generally about sustainable diets actually is one of our main campaigns. And you may not know that we are promoting something called Meat-Free May, because one of the most damaging in terms of climate changing practices of our modern society, especially Western society, is meat eating, which I'm sure quite a few of you nodding will know. I am actually vegetarian, but I'm not one of those evangelist vegetarians. But the research that we've been doing globally is showing that actually eating meat, because of the huge processing that goes on and the amount of land taken, is actually damaging our climate, and it's a big issue. So I just wanted to move, I agree with everything you both were saying, and it just reminded me that we have the Sustainable Diets campaign. And what we did a year ago is we opened a competition for students, which we called Get Gobby, because we were trying to relate to students, Get Gobby campaign. And we said, you tell us what you think is a good way of getting this message across about our diet, linking it to climate change. And this girl that won it has actually been an intern with us for the last year, and her idea was this Meat-Free May, and we've got some celebrities signed up to it, and people, that not all Friends of the Earth staff are vegetarian, contrary to popular beliefs. So quite a few staff are trying vegetarianism just for a month to sort of see what it's like, and they're writing blogs about it. You can find out about it on our website. And we've just, the reason why I wanted to come in was just launched another competition because it was so successful. We've got a lot of students applying. They can win £500 to go towards their studies or whatever. And it's a really great experience for them to work at our head office. So if anyone knows any students, do pass on about the Get Gobby campaign. Thank you.
To quiz Steve just a little bit on his comments he was making about carbon capture, because clearly we're in a terrible place as we agree on energy at the moment, and we've got to get where we want to get to, which will be renewables and a sustainable energy policy. So there's a long transitional programme that needs to happen. The Labour Party do not appear at the moment to have a transitional programme from one to the other, but I would imagine that coal does play a key part in that transition from where we are now to where we're going to get to. And I would have thought that carbon capture, or I'd hoped, I'm not a scientist, quite the opposite, but I would have hoped that carbon capture would be a solution in the transitional programme, but you were kind of saying that it's not a feasible option.
Would you like to comment? Or Stephen, would you like to comment?
I think the problem with carbon capture is that you don't actually capture it. The difference between acid gases like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides is that you can actually capture it and change essentially limestone into gypsum, and it's locked into that. What you can't do with carbon dioxide is actually capture it. In terms of coal, the amount of coal we will be using in Britain in 4 or 5 years' time will actually be very small, because all the coal-fired power stations do have to close down in the next 2 or 3 years under European legislation. So there actually won't be very much coal left to get rid of. I think it would be very dangerous to build new stations with carbon capture and storage, because coal-fired power stations last a long time, particularly up to 50 or 60 years. So building a new one would be locking us in for a very long time. So I think that would be a very dangerous thing to do.
But isn't it the case at the moment that electricity generation, at the moment, we are using 30% to 40% of that at the moment is coal?
Yes, it's true, but
there's
those
no transition.
But those coal-fired power stations have to close in the next 2 or 3 years. We have no choice over that under the European Large Combustion Plant Directive. We have to close them. They will be gone. So, and they're very old anyway, so we shouldn't regret their passing.
Well, you raise a wider question. No, I don't think at the moment, in the light of what's been said, I don't want to go into this in greater detail, but actually I do trust Miliband. We have to see what actually happens if Labour wins at all. I think he's the first Labour leader in the last 50 years who has begun to say, already tentatively, the things which I think most of us are dearly wanting to hear said. And he has talked privately about transformation a la Thatcher. Well, that is an enormous statement to make, and most of us will be sceptical until we actually see it begin to happen. But all I'm saying is, yes, I think the Labour Party, after what we've had in the last 5 years, 4 years, has to be radical if it is actually going to survive. Yeah. So I think the pressure of events, and it's not just, I mean, no one relies on MPs in Parliament anymore, it is the social movement. And the one thing which I think is lacking is a mass campaigning movement in the country. Not just on energy, but on a whole range of other issues, austerity, housing, National Health Service, etc. That is desperately needed. And I keep saying this privately, but it doesn't seem to happen. But we've also got other ideas. LRC is certainly one of the ways in which this can happen. Now, what about energy? I actually don't think, as Stephen said, that coal is actually going to be a transition to anywhere. It is the filthiest of the fuels. And carbon capture and storage, as has been said, it is just not practicable. I mean, the Americans, if it was practicable, would have produced a prototype, they would have shown how it could work, and as always, the UK would start copying it. But they haven't been able to do it with all the money that they've got. So I don't think that is a route which we can go down. And, you know, why do we have to talk about extending the life of the fossil fuels, which is actually what carbon capture and storage is about, rather than going directly to something that we control, that is the renewable sources in and around the UK, which we have in greater abundance than any other country in Europe? Surely that is a much better route to take.
Thanks very much for that. Could I just ask, would you do you see any prospect of Labour at the next election advocating sort of exciting transport policies? And so I think there is, in the public mood, there is that people do see a need for return of rail to public ownership.
Well, I would be absolutely staggered if we do not do this, for the very simple reason that it's the only case that I can think of in recent history where, according to the polls, 70-80%, which must include a hell of a lot of Tories, want rail to be taken back into public ownership. And where you've got such pressure, because of course the extremely high commuter prices which are having to be paid, which go up far faster than inflation, have done for years, because we have the most highest cost rail fares in Europe, and I'm not just saying that as a bit of rhetoric, that is a fact. We're having to pay twice the public subsidy to the privatised rail than we were giving to the nationalised rail industry. I mean, the arguments are so overwhelming. I won't say I'll eat my hat if we don't do it, but I'm getting close to it.
Thanks very much.